Hey guys, Paul Morrow here again for opsdesk.org, doing a big news recap for Thursday, 17 July. Here we go. So today, the judge lifted the gag order in the Brian Kohberger quadruple murder case as we come into the final sentencing because of the plea deal. Now, I've talked about this case a lot on the Ops Desk and on the Fox Network. Look, it always was a question, I think, for a lot of us when the plea deal came down as to why the prosecution folded. We know that two of the families were okay with it, two were not. And it looked to me like they had a very winnable case on the death penalty. They had gone 3 years on this case where the defense threw everything but the kitchen sink at the prosecution. The idea that they still had a plea deal on the table is very, very surprising, a little bit troubling. And I always wondered, and I talked about it here, was the fact that, they had great OPSEC. They kept operational security terrifically in the task force and the prosecution right up until they were about to go to trial. And then all of a sudden there were all these leaks. And the judge very pointedly offered a special prosecutor. Primarily, it seemed like he was talking to the defense to say, you want me to appoint a special prosecutor to look into these leaks? Well, you got to say to yourself, and I'm not out on a limb here, I don't think, because I'm not the only one who has mentioned this, although I'm kind of the only one. The idea that the special prosecutor investigation could lead to the prosecution side of things could have played a part. I hate to say it, but I think you have to admit that that's a possibility. The idea that a prosecutor or a clerk in the office or a cop or a detective, somebody in the mix on the side of the government is responsible for the leak. You're talking about careers that could be put at risk, maybe money changed hands in order to get some of the footage that they used in the Dateline NBC special. And it also just complicates the case because God knows what would have come up at trial relative to the leak. Today, the judge lifted the gag order, which never should have been put in place to begin with. The gag order is to protect the jury from being unduly influenced. There's been no jury after the plea deal, and yet they kept it in place. So the networks were going to sue, it looked like, in federal court. They were pressuring the judge, and the judge today lifted the order. The prosecution said, we're good with it. And okay, they lifted the order. And it just adds to some of the smoke around this thing in the endgame, because you got to say to yourself, why did they keep that gag order in place? And the judge kind of grudgingly lifted it. Prosecution is saying, we're still not going to talk. I don't know. It's not a great optic for the end of this case, where the task force did a great job. They got the right guy, and he was a solo actor. He didn't have any help. There's none of that crap. It's all conspiracy theory nonsense. They got the right guy. He's going to get locked up forever. Hopefully he just rots in jail. But it is a little bit of a bad taste it leaves after all of this great work to end this way. And I don't think it's a very clean finish. And who knows, maybe the last shoe hasn't dropped. And by the way, I'll be out there in Idaho for the network over the next, what is it going to be, Monday to Wednesday. I'll be out in Idaho. So tune in for some reporting on the final end of the Brian Kohberger case, a horrific crime. And again, we hope he rots in jail. All right, let's move on. ICE got access to the Medicaid databases to make sure there's no fraud relative to illegals. And of course, the left is losing their mind. Oh God, this is turning the Medicaid system into an enforcement agency and also the crap. Folks on the left, there's going to be nothing left in the system. These entitlements are already running dry. They only got a few years left. If you don't tighten it up somehow, there's going to be nothing left in the bank when the time comes for you to get your Medicaid and you to get your Social Security. And one of the ways to stop that bleeding is to make sure there's not fraud everywhere. And you might have hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people who shouldn't be getting benefits. This is the best way to do it without raising taxes in a draconian way. Wise up and stop. Of course, all the usual lefties are suing. California, all these states are suing. But they're idiots, because if you don't do this, you're going to have to raise taxes through the roof. And it's just not right. And also it's good because it's a disincentive for further illegals to come here because the gravy train is over. All right, let's move on. Scott MacFarlane, CBS reporter, says on the Chuck Todd podcast that he got diagnosed within 48 hours after the Trump shooting with PTSD from the crowd while he was there in Butler. Snowflake, get a new line of work. All right, the crowd scared you so much within 48 hours you went out on trauma leave? Bullshit. You don't get diagnosed with PTSD within 48 hours. This is nonsense. What a perfect metaphor for today's journalism. Lastly, Sean Duffy had it out with Gerald Nadler. Hey, listen, the New York City subways are a disgrace. Duffy is right. Sean, a former colleague of mine, now he's in government. Keep going. The NYPD has done everything they can, but the subways are a mess, and it's fault of the prosecutors who don't lock anybody up. Paul Morrow for the Ops Desk.